Hi everybody, it's Chaplain Messler. It is my privilege to be the wing chaplain for the 162nd Wing, and today I just want to give you a brief message about spiritual resiliency. I think that words matter. In fact, if there's been a pet peeve of mine through this COVID-19 crisis, it's been sometimes the words that we choose to use. I just want to give you one example. Everybody has been encouraging everybody to practice social distancing. Every time I hear that, I cringe a little. Social distancing? Is that really what we mean? I don't think that's what we mean. What we're really talking about is spatial distancing. Now, spatial distancing makes sense. I think we ought to follow the guidelines related to spatial distancing, but spatial distancing doesn't need to equal social isolation. In fact, it's important in the middle of this time that we are staying connected. And we have tools and technology right now in our world that can help us to do that in ways that respect the spatial distancing, but also keep us connected. That's just an example of one way that words matter. Today I'd like you to think about some other words that have popped up through this time. One of the words I've heard a lot is the word quarantine. Whether you've been officially quarantined because you were sick, or the stay-at-home order has sort of forced you into an ad hoc quarantine, that word has popped up. As we're going through this sort of quarantine right now, collectively as a society, there's a danger in that. This quarantine could turn into another word that I'd like you to think about, and that's the word quagmire. Now, quagmire is not a normal word that we use all the time, but it's a great word. What is a quagmire? A quagmire is like quicksand. A quagmire is like what happens when you have one of those bad dreams and you're trying to run away from the bad guys, but you just can't seem to run. That's a quagmire. It's a time when you're stuck. This quarantine could feel like a time when we're stuck, when life sort of just hits the pause button. Today isn't May whatever, it's March 49th, So we can get into a quagmire during this time of quarantine if we're not careful. But I've got another word for us to think about. I think this is a word that will give us a better spiritual and mental disposition as we go through this crisis. It's the word quest. I love the word quest. Someone who goes on a quest is aware of the challenges. They know that there are obstacles, that there's going to be opposition, and they prepare themselves for that quest. They go on a quest knowing that even though there are obstacles, it's going to be worth it, and they're going to come out better on the other end. A quest, now that's something we should be on. Stuck in a quagmire, that's something we need to avoid. So I want to give you some words that'll help us to turn this time of quarantine into a quest rather than it turning into a quagmire. Here's the first set of words I want you to think about. This time of quarantine could be a time when we are either stressed, that's one word, or the opposite, the other word, and this is a biblical word actually, it's the word Sabbath. As we're going through this quarantine, there's so much stuff that's out of our control. We don't control what the government's going to say. We certainly have trouble controlling the spread of this virus. And we could be stressed out about what's going to happen there. This may be impacting us financially. We may be experiencing added stressors at home. But rather than stress, we need to find Sabbath. The Hebrew scriptures tell us that God created this world in 6 days, and on the seventh day, he rested. He took Sabbath. That's what that word Sabbath means. It means to rest. That doesn't just mean kicking back, putting your feet up. It means being able to mentally relax. Here's one of the keys, I think, to finding ourselves in Sabbath, rest, rather than in stress. It's the ability to know the difference between what I can control and what I can't control. From God's perspective, he doesn't expect us to control things that we can't control. What he expects us to do is do the best with what we do have control over. I can always control my attitude. I can always control my words. I can always control my actions. I take responsibility for the things I can control. And then I have to develop the ability to take the things I can't control and trust God with those things. So as we're going through this quarantine, One of the ways to prevent us from getting into a quagmire, and rather to be on a quest, is to make sure that we avoid stress, being focused on the things outside of my control, and instead to find rest. That if I'm doing the best that I can with what I have, then God's going to take care of the rest. Let me ask you to think about another set of words. As we're going through this quarantine, one way that we could fall into that quagmire is if we become very focused on ourselves. If you turn in and look to yourself all the time, you'll get discouraged. There's something better than turning to self, and that is to seek opportunities of service. One of the things that's been encouraging to me personally going through this time are the text messages that I've received from friends. People have just asked, hey, how are you doing? I've enjoyed some of our neighbors and some of the people from our church family that have come by our house and dropped off baked goods. Think about something that you could do to serve your neighbors, to serve people in your church family, or maybe your extended family. Maybe there's someone in the 162nd family that you could reach out to. Just make sure that they're doing okay. If we can get ourselves focused on service rather than on self, we'll be on a quest rather than stuck in the quagmire during this quarantine. Then I've got one last set of words I want you to think about. Stagnation versus strengthening. As I mentioned earlier, during this time of quarantine, it feels like we've collectively hit the pause button. And in some ways we have. Our economy in lots of ways has been paused. Even in our 162nd family, we paused April drill. We're pausing some things that we're doing in May. So in some ways we have hit the pause button. But personally, in your life, you don't have to hit the pause button during this time of quarantine. We don't want this time of quarantine to be a time when we stagnate. Instead of stagnation, we ought to seek opportunities for strengthening who we are, to grow. This has been a great time for me personally. On Sundays, for instance, I'm usually part of a church, and we're part of a church service and have multiple responsibilities. But those responsibilities have been toned down just a little bit. That's given me a little bit more time in my personal life to strengthen my relationship with God, with my wife, and with my kids. We've done some fun things as a family. I really do think my family is going to come out of this time of quarantine stronger than we were at the start. And there are opportunities for you in the middle of this quarantine to, rather than stagnate, to seek opportunities for growth and for growing stronger. And so words matter. I want to keep this message today brief. In this time of quarantine, avoid the quagmire. Don't get stuck. Instead, go on a spiritual and mental quest. Don't get stressed about the things you can't control. Instead, find rest, Sabbath, in the fact that God's got it. When you're going through this quarantine, don't get so focused on yourself that you forget to serve other people. Take proactive steps to find ways to serve other people in your family and your community. You can do that while still respecting the spatial distancing. And thirdly, let me encourage you, don't stagnate. Seek opportunities to grow stronger personally through this time. Maybe this is a great time for you to grow stronger in your spiritual life. Let me just encourage you, as I started off with, this is a time not for social distancing. Spatial distancing, sure, but stay connected. We here in the 162nd Chaplain's Office are here for you. You can reach out to us anytime. We'd love to help you. We'd love to help your family. We'd love to stay connected with you. Thank you so much for giving me some of your time. Let's be on a quest. Let's get out of the quagmire.